The temperature had dropped to 40 below zero, and the blizzard had been raging for 6 days straight when Anders Bjornson realized his firewood was nearly gone and his cabin stove was losing the battle against the killing cold. What happened next, a desperate innovation born from watching his partner freeze to death 3 months earlier, would change how trappers survived winter storms across the northern Rockies for the next 3 decades. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity move you, hit subscribe because tomorrow's tale of survival might be even more impossible than this one. The wind had been howling for 3 days when Anders Bjornson woke to silence inside the cabin. The kind of silence that meant something was wrong. He opened his eyes in the darkness and immediately felt the cold pressing against his face. His breath came out in visible clouds. The cabin stove, which should have been radiating heat, was barely warm. It was November 18, 1839, and the Wind River Range of Wyoming Territory was locked in an early winter storm that had trapped Anders and his partner, Magnus Lindgren, inside their cabin for 72 hours. They had thought they were prepared. 2 cords of split wood stacked inside, enough dried meat and flour to last a month, a solid log cabin, a cast-iron stove hauled up from Fort Bridger. Anders sat up slowly, his joints stiff from cold. The interior temperature felt barely above freezing. He looked across the cabin to where Magnus slept on the other bunk, wrapped in wool blankets and a bearskin. Magnus hadn't moved. Anders pulled on his boots and walked the 5 steps to his partner's bunk. He reached out and touched Magnus's shoulder. The cold came through the blankets immediately. Magnus Lindgren was dead. His face was peaceful, as if he had simply fallen asleep and never woken. There were no signs of struggle. Hypothermia had taken him quietly, while Anders slept 6 feet away. They had trapped together for 4 years. Magnus was 32 years old, born in Sweden, and had come to America with dreams of making enough money to bring his younger sister over. Now he would never see her again. The cabin stove had gone cold sometime in the night. Anders checked the firebox and found only ash and embers. He looked at the wood stack near the door. Half gone. They had been burning through wood trying to keep the cabin warm. The problem was brutal. The stove consumed enormous amounts of fuel but held heat for only a few hours. Every time they opened the door to bring in more wood, warmth escaped. Anders rebuilt the fire, watching the flames catch. Warmth slowly began to fill the space, but it felt hollow. He sat on his bunk and worked through what had happened. Magnus had taken the last watch, feeding the fire until midnight, then had gone to sleep, trusting the stove would hold heat until morning. But the wood had burned faster than expected, the fire had died, and the cold had crept in. Most trappers would have accepted this as inevitable tragedy. Men died in the mountains. The wilderness took its price. You buried your dead when the ground thawed and moved on. But something in Anders refused to accept it. Magnus had died in his own cabin with a stove and firewood present, killed by a problem that should have been solvable. Anders spent the rest of that day preparing Magnus's body, wrapping him in blankets and moving him outside where the cold would preserve him. Then he went back inside and began thinking about how mountain men stayed warm. After burying Magnus in a snowbank where the frozen ground made digging impossible, Anders spent the following weeks in methodical observation. The storm had passed and the trapping season continued, but something had changed in him. He could not let go of what had happened. Every time he fed his cabin stove, every time he opened the door to retrieve more wood, he thought about the fundamental problem that had killed his partner. Anders began visiting neighboring trappers' camps within a day's travel. He observed their heating systems with focused attention. The pattern was consistent and troubling. Every cabin relied on the same basic approach: a cast-iron stove or stone fireplace positioned inside the living space, wood fuel stored nearby, constant tending required throughout the day and night. At Sven Halvorsson's camp 12 miles north, Anders watched Sven feed his stove every 3 hours. The Norwegian trapper had been in the mountains for 8 years and considered himself an expert on winter survival. His cabin was well built, with tight chinking and a good roof, but the heating system suffered from the same flaws. The stove radiated intense heat when freshly fed, but that heat dissipated quickly. The cast iron held warmth for perhaps an hour after the fire died down, then the cold began creeping back in. The problems became clearer with each. Camp Anders visited. Cabin stoves consumed enormous quantities of wood. A typical trapper burned through half a cord per week during deep winter, requiring constant wood gathering and splitting. The work was exhausting and dangerous during storms. Opening the cabin door to bring in more fuel created immediate heat loss. Cold air rushed in, warm air rushed out, and the stove had to work harder to restore the interior temperature. The cycle was inefficient and unsustainable during extended bad weather. Fire risk was another constant concern. The stove sat inside a wooden structure separated from flammable walls and roof by only a few feet. Sparks, overfeeding, or a cracked firebox could ignite the cabin. Anders had seen the remains of burned structures where trappers had died trying to stay warm. The choice was often between freezing and burning. Smoke presented yet another challenge. Even with a proper chimney, cabin stoves filled living spaces with smoke when wind conditions shifted, or when the chimney developed creosote buildup. Trappers lived in a constant haze, their eyes burning, their lungs taking in wood smoke with every breath. During storms, when drafts failed, the smoke could become thick enough to drive a man outside into the killing cold. The most critical flaw was heat retention. Cast iron stoves and stone fireplaces radiated warmth only while fire burned inside them. Once the fuel was consumed and the fire died, heat dissipated within hours. There was no thermal mass to sustain warmth through the long winter nights. A trapper either woke every few hours to feed the fire or accepted that his cabin would be near freezing by morning. Anders realized something that winter that most trappers never questioned. The entire system was designed for failure. Fire and living space occupied the same structure, creating conflict between safety and survival. Heat needed to come from outside, sustained by something more permanent than a constantly burning fire. That realization would not leave him alone. Alone in his cabin during a December cold snap, Anders found himself unable to sleep. The stove burned steadily, casting flickering shadows across the log walls, but his mind kept circling back to the same question. How could heat be sustained without constant fire tending? How could warmth be separated from the danger of flame inside a wooden structure? He lay on his bunk, wrapped in wool blankets, and let his thoughts drift back to childhood memories he had not considered in years. Anders had been born in Norway, in a small farming valley where winters were brutal and fuel was precious. His grandmother's farmhouse had possessed a heating system unlike anything he had seen since coming to America. The house had been warmed by a massive masonry stove called a gruoven that sat in one corner of the main room. What made the stove remarkable was not its size, but its function. The fire burned inside a firebox lined with soapstone and brick. But the dal, heat did not radiate directly into the room. Instead, hot gases from the fire traveled through internal channels built into the masonry mass before exiting through the chimney. The stone absorbed the heat and radiated it slowly into the house for hours after the fire had died. Anders remembered watching his grandfather tend that stove, feeding it split birch logs, then closing the heavy iron door and adjusting the dampers. Within an hour, the massive stone structure would be warm to the touch. It stayed warm all day. Even in the coldest months, the house remained comfortable with only 2 firings per day. The secret was thermal mass. Stone absorbed heat and released it slowly over time. Another memory surfaced from his years at sea before coming to the mountains. Anders had worked briefly on merchant ships trading in Pacific ports. In one Korean harbor town, he had gone ashore and been invited into a house by local traders. The winter weather was cold, but the house was remarkably warm despite having no visible stove or fireplace. When Anders asked about the heating system, his host explained through broken English and gestures. The Koreans heated their homes using a system called ondol, where fire burned in a firebox outside or beneath the house. Hot gases from that fire traveled through stone channels, built under the floor before exiting through a chimney. The floor itself became warm, radiating heat upward into the living space. The fire burned in one location, but the entire house benefited from the warmth. Anders sat up in his bunk, his heart beating faster. The principle was the same in both systems: fire in one location, heat traveling through stone channels, thermal mass absorbing and radiating warmth long after combustion ended. What if he could adapt that principle to frontier conditions? What if he could build a system where fire burned outside his cabin, protected from wind and weather, while heat traveled underground through stone to warm his living space? The idea seemed impossible. He had no soapstone, no skilled masons, no architectural plans. But he had stones from the creek. He had snow for insulation. He had the memory of systems that worked. January 1840 brought temperatures that rarely climbed above zero. Anders should have been running his trap lines, checking for beaver and marten, but instead he spent his days digging in frozen ground and carrying stones from a partially frozen creek a quarter-mile from his cabin. The first experiment was crude and small. He wanted to test the principle before committing to a full system. Anders selected a spot 10 feet from his cabin door and began excavating. The ground was frozen solid for the first 6 inches, requiring a pickaxe to break through. Below that, the soil was merely hard, and he could work it with a shovel. He dug a trench 3 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 1 foot deep. From the creek, he gathered flat stones, the kind that stacked well. His hands went numb carrying loads back to the cabin, but he continued until he had enough to line the trench. He placed stones along the bottom, then built up the sides, creating a crude channel. The work was imprecise. Gaps existed between stones. The structure was fragile, but it was a beginning. He covered the stone channel with bark stripped from dead trees, then mounded dirt over the top. At one end, he built a small fire pit lined with stones. At the other end, he left an opening. The theory was simple: light a fire at one end, and heat should travel through the channel to the other end. Anders lit a fire in the pit using dry kindling and split pine. The fire caught quickly and burned hot. He fed it for an hour, waiting to see if heat would travel through his underground channel. He placed his hand over the opening at the far end. Nothing. The stones near the fire grew warm, but heat was escaping upward through the bark and dirt covering rather than traveling horizontally through the channel. The first attempt was a failure, but it taught him something important. Heat naturally rises. To force it to travel horizontally, he needed better insulation and a more sealed channel. He dismantled the experiment and tried again with modifications. This time, he used larger, flatter stones that fit together more tightly. He sealed gaps between stones with clay he dug from the creek bank and mixed with water. He made the covering thicker, piling more dirt on top. The second attempt showed improvement. Heat traveled farther down the channel, but still most of it escaped through the covering. He could feel warmth at the far end, but it was faint and inconsistent. The structure was also unstable. After 2 days, part of the stone lining collapsed inward, blocking the channel. Anders rebuilt it again, using more clay, selecting stones even more carefully. The results improved marginally, but he was still losing too much heat. Then, 3 days into his experiments, a heavy snowfall blanketed the area. 8 inches of fresh snow covered his experimental tunnel. When Anders lit the next fire, something changed. Heat stopped escaping upward. The snow acted as insulation far superior to dirt or bark. When he checked the far end of the channel, the warmth was unmistakable, strong, sustained. The breakthrough was snow itself. Snow was not the enemy of his system. Snow was the solution. February 1840 was the coldest month Anders had experienced in his 7 years in the mountains. Temperatures stayed below zero for weeks. Most trappers hunkered down, venturing out only when absolutely necessary. Anders worked outside in conditions that should have driven him back to his fire. He selected a location 8 feet from his cabin's north wall. The distance was deliberate. He wanted maximum separation between open flame and wooden structure while keeping the tunnel short enough to retain heat efficiently. He marked out the path his tunnel would follow, a straight line from the external fire chamber to a point that would terminate beneath his cabin floor. The excavation was brutal work. The ground was frozen harder than it had been in January. Anders used his pickaxe to break through the surface, then his shovel to remove the loosened earth. He worked in short bursts, warming himself by his cabin stove every hour before returning to the trench. The tunnel needed to be 6 feet long, 18 inches wide, and 2 feet deep. Progress was measured in inches per day. By the end of the first week, he had excavated the full length. The trench cut through frozen earth like a scar across the landscape. Anders stood looking at it, his back aching, his hands blistered even through leather gloves. The real work was about to begin. He needed stones, hundreds of them, flat stones that would stack and fit together to create walls and a roof for his tunnel. The creek was partially frozen, but sections remained open where the current ran fast. Anders spent 3 days at the creek, selecting stones, loading them into a canvas sling, and hauling them back to his cabin. Each trip brought 30 to 40 pounds of stone. He made the journey 20 times. The stone lining began with the tunnel floor. Anders placed flat stones as uniformly as possible, creating a level base. Then he built the walls, stacking stones on both sides of the trench. He selected each stone for how it fit with its neighbors, turning them, testing positions, finding the configuration that created the tightest seal. Gaps were inevitable, but he kept them minimal. He mixed clay from the creek bank with water he heated on his stove, creating a thick mortar. He packed this mixture into every gap between stones, sealing the channel. The clay froze almost immediately in the cold air, but Anders worked quickly, keeping his mixture warm, applying it before it became too stiff to use. The roof was the most challenging part. He needed stones that could span the 18-inch width without collapsing inward. He selected the largest, flattest stones he had gathered and laid them across the top of the walls, creating a stone ceiling. More clay sealed the joints. The entire stone channel took 2 weeks to complete. At the far end, away from the cabin, Anders built the fire chamber. He excavated a space 2 feet square and 2 feet deep. He lined it with his largest stones, creating a firebox that could hold a substantial fire. He left an opening at ground level for loading fuel and built up the sides to contain the flames. For the chimney, he used a section of stovepipe salvaged from an abandoned trapper's camp he had found the previous year. Early March, 1840. Anders stood beside his completed fire chamber, holding a handful of dry kindling and a burning stick from his cabin stove. 6 weeks of work had led to this moment. The stone-lined tunnel stretched from this external firebox to the opening he had cut in his cabin floor. Heavy snow covered the entire system, 3 feet deep in places, providing the insulation his early experiments had shown was critical. He placed the kindling in the stone firebox, arranged split pine logs on top, and touched the burning stick to the dry material. The fire caught immediately, flames spreading through the kindling and beginning to consume the larger wood. Anders fed the fire carefully, adding more fuel as the flames grew. Smoke rose through the stovepipe chimney, venting cleanly into the cold air. He stayed outside for 30 minutes, tending the fire, building it to a strong, hot burn. The stones around the firebox began to warm. He could feel heat radiating from them when he held his hand close. Then he walked back to his cabin and went inside. The interior was cold. He had let his cabin stove go out that morning, wanting to test his tunnel system without interference from any other heat source. He sat on his bunk and waited. 1 hour passed. Nothing changed. The cabin remained cold. Anders felt doubt creeping in. 6 weeks of back-breaking work. All that stone carried from the creek. All those hours digging in frozen ground. For nothing. He returned outside and added more wood to the fire chamber. The flames were strong, the firebox glowing with heat. He went back inside and waited. Another 30 minutes. Then, so gradually, he almost missed it. Warmth began to rise from the opening in his cabin floor. Anders knelt beside the opening and held his hand over it. Warm air was definitely flowing upward. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the ambient cabin temperature. He stayed there, monitoring the heat, feeling it grow stronger. Within another hour, the warmth was unmistakable. The air rising from the tunnel carried heat that had traveled 6 feet underground from the external fire chamber. He fed the fire chamber every hour for the next 3 hours, maintaining a strong burn. The stones in the tunnel were absorbing heat, the thermal mass building. By mid-afternoon, Anders let the fire die down to coals, then to nothing. He returned to his cabin and waited to see what would happen. The warmth continued. Even with no fire burning in the external chamber, heat kept rising through the floor opening. The stones were radiating the energy they had absorbed, releasing it slowly into the tunnel, warming the air that flowed into his cabin. Anders monitored the temperature, noting how long the warmth lasted. 6 hours after the fire had died completely, the tunnel was still producing noticeable warmth. 8 hours later, it had diminished but remained above the outside temperature. By the 12-hour mark, the heat had faded to barely perceptible, but it had lasted half a day from a single 3-hour firing. Anders sat in his cabin as darkness fell, wrapped in a blanket, feeling the residual warmth still rising from his tunnel. The system worked. Stone thermal mass plus snow insulation equaled sustained heat. One firing could keep him comfortable far longer than any cabin stove he had ever used. Mid-March 1840 brought weather reports from passing travelers that made experienced trappers nervous. A massive storm system was building over the northern territories, the kind of sustained blizzard that could last a week or more. Most trappers prepared by gathering extra firewood, checking their cabin stoves, and settling in to wait it out. Anders prepared differently. He saw the approaching storm as the ultimate test of his tunnel system. He spent 2 days gathering firewood, but he needed far less than he would have for his cabin stove. His calculations suggested the tunnel system was at least 3 times more efficient. He stacked split logs near the external fire chamber, covering them with canvas to keep them dry. He gathered enough food and water to avoid leaving his cabin except to tend the fire. Then he waited for the storm to arrive. It came on March 17th. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero overnight, and by morning, snow was falling heavily. Wind built throughout the day, creating whiteout conditions by afternoon. Anders could barely see the outline of the trees beyond his cabin. This was exactly the kind of storm that had killed Magnus 4 months earlier. He fired the tunnel system at dawn, loading the stone firebox with wood and building a strong fire. The flames burned for 2 hours before he let them die back. He returned to his cabin and monitored the heat rising through his floor opening. Within an hour, warmth was flowing steadily into his living space. The cabin temperature climbed to a comfortable level and stayed there throughout the morning. At noon, he ventured outside to fire the system again. The external fire chamber was positioned in a natural depression that provided some wind protection, and the heavy snow around it created additional shelter. He loaded wood, relit the fire from coals still glowing in the stone firebox, and tended it for another 2 hours. Then, back inside. The pattern continued for 7 days. Twice daily, morning and evening, Anders made the short trip from his cabin door to the fire chamber. Each firing required 2 hours of burning time. Each firing produced 10 to 12 hours of sustained warmth in his cabin. The stone tunnel absorbed heat during the firing and radiated it continuously afterward. The snow insulation prevented any heat loss upward or sideways, forcing all the warmth to travel toward his cabin interior. The storm raged without pause. Wind speeds made it dangerous to be outside for more than a few minutes. Snow accumulated in drifts 4 feet deep. The temperature never climbed above zero. These were the conditions that killed unprepared men, that drove trappers to desperate measures, that led to cabin fires from overfed stoves or deaths from hypothermia when fuel ran out. Anders stayed comfortable. His cabin remained warm enough that he could work on equipment repairs, read, sleep soundly without waking, to tend a fire. He never ran short of wood because his system consumed so little. He never filled his living space with smoke. He never risked a cabin fire from sparks or overfeeding. His innovation had separated him from the deadly cycle that trapped other mountain men. When the storm finally broke on March 24th, Anders emerged to find his cabin buried in snowdrifts, but his system still functioning perfectly. April 1840 brought the spring thaw and the return of social contact among the scattered trapping community. Trappers who had isolated themselves through the worst of winter began visiting neighboring camps, sharing news, trading supplies, and exchanging stories about how they had survived the brutal March storms. When Sven Halvorsen arrived at Anders's cabin in mid-April, he noticed immediately that something was different. There was no woodpile near the door, no massive stack of split logs that typically marked a trapper's cabin after a hard winter. The cabin itself looked undisturbed, but Sven could see evidence of activity near a snow-covered mound 8 feet from the structure. Anders invited him inside for coffee. The cabin was warm despite no fire burning in the stove. Sven looked around, confused. "Where is your heat coming from?" Anders explained his tunnel system. He described the stone-lined channel, the external fire chamber, the snow insulation, the thermal mass principle. He walked Sven outside and showed him the fire chamber, now partially exposed as snow melted. He explained how heat traveled underground from this point into his cabin, how 2 firings per day kept him comfortable through the worst storms. Sven listened with growing disbelief. When Anders finished, the Norwegian trapper laughed. "You spent how long building this? 6 weeks?" "Anders, a man can build a perfectly good cabin stove setup in 2 days. Why would you waste so much time on something so complicated?" "Because it works better," Anders said simply. "It works?" Sven shook his head. "You are heating your cabin with a fire that burns 8 feet away underground. That makes no sense. Heat rises, everyone knows this. You cannot make heat travel sideways through dirt." "Through stone," Anders corrected. "And with snow insulation, yes, you can." "This is not Norway." Sven gestured at the fire chamber. "This is Bjornson's buried stove, and it is the work of a man who has been alone too long. I am sorry about Magnus, but building this strange thing will not bring him back." Word spread quickly through the trapping community. Within 2 weeks, half a dozen trappers had visited Anders's camp to see his tunnel system. Most reactions ranged from confusion to outright mockery. They called it Bjornson's folly. They joked that grief had driven him mad. Why would anyone spend weeks building something so elaborate when traditional methods worked adequately? Only one trapper asked serious questions. Eric Thorson was younger, perhaps 25, and had been in the mountains for only 3 years. He examined the fire chamber carefully, traced the path of the tunnel to the cabin, asked about stone selection and construction techniques. "How much warmer is your cabin compared to a regular stove?" "It is not about being warmer," Anders explained. "It is about being warm longer, with less work and less danger. I fire this system twice a day. A cabin stove needs feeding every 3 hours. I use 1/3 the wood. There is no smoke in my living space, no fire risk to my cabin. And during that week-long storm in March, I never once worried about running out of fuel or freezing." Eric nodded slowly, thinking. But he did not commit to building one himself. Anders accepted the skepticism. He knew what he had built worked. Validation would come when it mattered most. November 1840 brought the earliest winter weather anyone in the territory could remember. By the second week of the month, temperatures had already dropped below 0, and veteran trappers spoke nervously about what the rest of the season might bring. Their concerns proved justified on November 19th, when a storm system moved in that would be remembered for decades. The blizzard struck without the usual warning signs. Temperature plunged to 30 below 0 in a matter of hours. Wind speeds made it impossible to see more than a few feet. Snow fell so heavily that drifts built to 5 feet within the first day. And the storm did not pass. It settled over the Wind River Range and stayed day after day, with no break in the wind or snowfall. Anders rode it out using his tunnel system, firing it twice daily, staying warm and comfortable while the wilderness raged outside. He had plenty of firewood because his system used so little. He could tend the external fire chamber even in whiteout conditions because it was only steps from his cabin door. The work was cold and unpleasant, but it took less than 10 minutes twice a day. The rest of his time was spent inside his warm cabin, waiting for the storm to break. On the 10th day, the weather finally cleared. Anders emerged to find his camp buried under snowdrifts that reached his cabin's roofline in places. He dug out his door, checked his trap lines, and began the work of clearing paths. 2 days later, Erik Thorson appeared, struggling through the deep snow on snowshoes. Erik's face was grim. 3 men are dead. 2 more barely survived. The news spread through the surviving trappers over the following week. Thomas Crawford and James Miller, both experienced mountain men with 7 years in the territory, had frozen to death in their respective cabins. Both had run out of firewood by day 6 of the storm. Both had tried to burn furniture and floorboards to stay warm. Both had eventually succumbed to hypothermia as their cabins grew colder. Their bodies were found frozen in their bunks when neighbors checked on them after the storm passed. Peter Voss had died differently. He had attempted to keep an oversized fire burning in his cabin stove to combat the extreme cold. The overheated stove had ignited his cabin wall. Voss had died from smoke inhalation trying to fight the fire. His cabin had burned completely despite the surrounding snow. Sven Halvorsen had survived, but barely. He had burned his table, his extra bunk, even part of his floorboards to keep his stove going. His cabin was damaged, his food supplies depleted, and he had suffered frostbite on both hands and feet from desperate trips outside to gather any burnable material he could find. Nils Andersson, a trapper with 15 years of mountain experience, visited Anders's camp 3 days after the storm. He was a quiet man, respected throughout the territory for his skill and judgment. He examined Anders's tunnel system without speaking, walking around the fire chamber, looking at where the tunnel connected to the cabin, asking technical questions about construction and operation. Finally, Nils said, "Show me how to build one." The mockery stopped. Survival spoke louder than skepticism. Winter 1840 through 1845 saw the spread of underground heat tunnel systems through the northern Rockies trapping community. The technique did not spread universally. Many trappers continued using traditional cabin stoves, either from skepticism or unwillingness to invest the construction effort. But those who faced serious winter conditions began building what the community now called Bjornson tunnels. Erik Thorson built the first one in December 1840. He visited Anders's camp for 3 days, studying every detail of the construction. Anders answered everything openly, sharing his techniques without reservation. Erik returned to his camp and spent 4 weeks building his system. When the brutal cold of January 1841 arrived, Erik survived comfortably while trappers with traditional setups struggled. Nils Andersson built a variation adapted to his terrain. His camp sat on rocky ground where excavation was difficult, so he built his tunnel partially above ground, then buried it under packed snow and earth. The principle remained the same: external fire chamber, stone-lined heat channel, thermal mass for sustained warmth. By winter 1842, 7 trappers in the Wind River Range were using tunnel heating systems. By 1843, the technique had spread to the Absaroka Range and the Beartooth Mountains as trappers shared knowledge across territories. Each builder adapted the design to available materials and local conditions. The technique saved lives in ways that could be documented and ways that would never be recorded. During the severe winter of 1844, a trapper named Jacob Klein survived a 12-day storm using a tunnel system. 2 trappers in adjacent valleys without such systems died during the same storm. Frontier journals mention the tunnel heating method occasionally. A letter from a Wyoming Territory trading post in 1845 describes the Norwegian trapper's underground stove that keeps cabins warm through the longest storms. An account from 1846 refers to the stone tunnel method that northern trappers favor for efficiency. Anders left the mountains in 1847. The fur trade was declining, and opportunities drew men westward. He invested his savings in a small farm near Street Paul, Minnesota. He married Ingrid, a Swedish immigrant, in 1848. They had 4 children. Anders worked his farm and lived quietly. He died in 1873 at age 61. His obituary mentioned his years as a trapper but said nothing about heating innovations. To his family and neighbors, he was simply a former mountain man who had become a successful farmer. But in the mountains of Wyoming and Montana, stone-lined tunnels continued channeling warmth through winter storms. Prospectors in the Tannelissine 1850s learned the technique from old trappers. Homesteaders built variations using the same principles. The innovation persisted because it solved a fundamental problem: staying warm when fuel is limited and storms are deadly. Anders Bjornson never patented his system, never sought recognition, never wrote about his innovation. He built something that worked and shared it freely. That quiet legacy, measured not in fame but in lives saved, endured far longer than the man himself.